There's something indescribably magical about watching young minds activated and willing to learn new things. It's one thing to be excited seeing a young mind absorb knowledge like a sponge. It's yet another thing seeing an adult mind go to waste because they may be too inept to do simple research, especially when it pertains to their own history. Well, ADOS FBA crowd, take out your pens and paper to take notes. School's in, and you're about to learn a reality lesson. The people you hold sacred are actually using you to divide and conquer your people. And it seems you haven't figured it out yet, that you are being played. It really irks me how some people, no matter what their ethnicity or where they come from, almost always have an affinity for their oppressors. They hate themselves and their people while loving their masters. They absolutely know what their people have been through in their respective countries, but choose to love the ones who cause them pain much more. Take these two new groups that call themselves movements as examples. ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, and FBAs, Foundational Black Americans, claim to be lineage-based identity movements that advocate for the specific interests of Black Americans whose ancestors were enslaved in the United States. The problem with this is, on one hand, they believe they are descendants of slaves and seek reparations for slavery. On the other hand, they believe they are not descendants of slaves, but indigenous, Native Americans to this land, but they still want reparations for slavery. By the way, if you take a look at their logos and flags, they'll tell you exactly who these ADOS and FBAs are really getting their marching orders from. It's the same people who have colonized other peoples around the world and created their flags. If you think I'm exaggerating, then I'll just leave this right here. You can do your own research. The ADOS and FBA crowd like to tell historical half-truths and innuendos, muddying the historical waters of Black history, including African, Caribbean, and Black American history, omitting key facts, distorting context, and implying false conclusions. One such example is where they came from. Historical evidence, including carbon dating and artifacts, show that all human life originated in Africa. There's no argument coming from anyone about this except from racists who still can't accept this. And of course, the ADOS and FBA crowd, who say they're not of African descent. Let's look at this with facts and common sense. Evidence consistently show that humans originated in Africa. End of statement, point blank, period. But for the benefits of the slow people in the back of the classroom, let's look at history. Tangible DNA and historical evidence show that the Black man is the original man on Earth and date back millions of years. This evidence also shows that migration of these people started between 1.5 and 200,000 years ago. About 40,000 years ago, these Africans landed in the West Asian continent, in what is now called today Europe. Mind you, a key genetic mutation linked to lighter-skinned Europeans likely appeared between 20,000 to 50,000 years ago in Europe. So there are all types of evidence showing who was in Europe first, including, but not limited to, La Brana man, a 7,000-year-old skeleton found in northern Spain. Lochboer man, Luxembourg, another Mesolithic hunter-gatherer with genes for dark skin, part of the same Western hunter-gatherer lineage. Ivory Bangle lady, a wealthy woman buried in York during Roman times, likely of North African descent, showing high status and integration. And of course, Cheddar Man, who is one of the most iconic prehistoric figures in British archaeology. Discovered in 1903 in Gough's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset, his remains date back roughly 10,000 years to the Mesolithic period, making him the oldest nearly complete Homo sapien skeleton found in Britain. His DNA analysis revealed he likely had dark to black skin, challenging long-held assumptions about early Europeans. Between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, Africans migrated east to what is now called Asia. Despite what world medias deliberately delete from showing you, the original peoples of Asia were black, including, but not limited to, Palestinians, Yemenis, Arabians, Omanis, Bahrainis, Iraqis, Iranians, Baluchis, Indian, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Vietnam, China, Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. Between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, Africans migrated east to what is now called Southeast Asia and the South Pacific Islands. The original peoples in this region were also black, including, but not limited to, Chamorro Mariana Islands, Melanesia, Micronesia, Timor, Cook Island, Palau, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Tasmania, Polynesia, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Maori New Zealand, and Australia. Now here comes the interesting part. Between 100,000 and 15,000 years ago, these migratory peoples traveled through South Asia, Central Asia, and Siberia to cross the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, evolving and mixing along the way. These migrants were descendants of ancient North Siberians and East Asians, who carried deep African ancestry. Some early American skeletons, like Naya from Mexico around 12,000 years ago, show Africoid cranial traits, such as broad noses and prognathism. This is just one route these groups found their way to the Americas from Africa. There are at least two more ways that existed. One way was by ships from these people living in Asia and the South Pacific. The other way was also by ships, but through the currents that Africans traveled directly from the motherland to the Americas. In his best-selling book, They Came Before Columbus, The African Presence in Ancient America, Dr. Ivan van Sertima maintains that in the year 1311, King Al-Umar Musa Abu Bakr II traveled from the Malian kingdom in Africa to the Americas in 2,000 ships, 1,000 ships for him and his men, and 1,000 ships bearing food and water. The following is an excerpt of Dr. Ivan van Sertima from a 1980 interview on the subject.
Good evening. Ask any youngster, or any adult for that matter, when did Africans first come to America? And the answer will be in 1619 as indentured servants. Well, that answer is no longer valid, according to Dr. Ivan van Sertima, author of They Came Before Columbus. Dr. van Sertima, an anthropologist and historian, is a graduate of London University and Rutgers Graduate School of Anthropology. He is also a literary critic and has been honored by the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy by being asked to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize in Literature for the past 5 years. Currently, he is Professor of African Studies at Rutgers University. Dr. van Sertima, up until relatively recently, what had scholars been saying about Africans in the pre-Columbus period in the Americas?
Well, there is a very profound distortion of African history. Almost all of the books that have been written on Africa have been studies of primitives, of people in small communities just barely scratching the soil, people in jungles, etc. There is no appreciation of the fact that after the conquest, or just around the time of the conquest and after, you have a tremendous breaking up of African societies. It's not just a question of tearing these people out of their country, throwing them across the Atlantic as slaves, but the smashing of many things. It's as if you had dropped several hydrogen bombs on Africa. So that what you see afterwards is just the remnants, the ruins of the worst in Africa. The African, therefore, the image of the African ancestor has been built up upon the lowest common denominator. When we go back to European history, European heritage, we always go back to its great heroes, its magnificent achievements. But when we go back into Africa, historians and anthropologists have always looked for the worst. When in fact you begin to study African history seriously, and recent archaeological discoveries have now throwing up remarkable things. They've found within recent years, for example, that the Africans were producing steel in Tanzania, East Africa, 1500 years before the Europeans. That they had not only entered the age of iron before Europe, but they had jumped into the age of steel. Now what has happened to this? If you go back into Tanzania today, you cannot find this. You cannot find that kind of development. Therefore, you begin to be aware that colonization, the conquest of Europe, didn't drag people up. It actually smashed things that were happening there. Now these things are coming out of the earth because archaeology is beginning to recover these things. African history cannot be recovered, and even American history, early history, cannot be recovered like European history, because Europe has had the advantage after the conquest of having about 5 centuries of fairly settled history. They can go to their libraries, etc., in spite of the wars. But in Africa, the library is in the ground. The record of what has happened, the broken record, lies there. Now they're finding astronomical observatories. 2 years ago, they found that the Africans were involved in the most complex astronomy, that they had plotted a whole star system. This is in Kenya, at Namorotunga. They found among the Dogon in West Africa that Africans had plotted an invisible star 700 years before it was discovered by European astronomers in the 20th century, and that the plotting of the orbit and trajectory of this star, which is a white dwarf, an invisible star, Sirius B, the trajectory and the plotting of the orbits and trajectories are as accurate as that done by satellites in the 20th century. Recently, yesterday in fact, just before I came here, the New York Times brought out a startling article showing that the Africans had entered the domestication of cattle in East Africa 7,000 years before it occurred anywhere else in the world. And this is one of the bases. This is one of the bases of civilization. So that you have to look again at the African. It is because the capacity of the African, the potential of the African, has been reduced in our imagination and our consciousness by these studies of primitives, that we do not realize that the African was involved in things that are just as important, just as significant, and in some areas even more significant than what was happening in Europe before the Industrial Revolution.
What is the main idea in your book, They Came Before Columbus?
The main idea in my book is to show that early America before the coming of Columbus, was a far more complex society than people imagined, and that it involved Africans. Africans came in here. They came in on several occasions. Sometimes these were accidents, sometimes they were on purpose, and that they had an influence, an actual impact and influence upon the formation of certain American civilization.
When we say pre-Columbus period, what are we talking about?
We're talking about long before 1492. It is absurd, and only fools can still believe that Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492. In fact, Columbus never even came to this continent. Columbus wandered about in the Caribbean islands, just on the very edge of the great civilizations. Cortez came here in 1519, and he entered Mexico. And Mexico, when I speak of Mexico in this program, do not confuse it simply with the Mexico we know today. That was a center of a civilization that spread over a great part of this continent. That, when Cortez entered, he had come out of the heart of Europe, and he said when he entered Native America, when he entered Mexico, and he saw the pyramids and the palaces and the floating gardens and the zoos and the aqueducts and the running baths, he says, I have not seen its like in Europe.
So, the main idea in your book, you were dealing with that initially.
The main idea in my book is that there were visits to this continent from the old world, that there were visits to the Native Americans in this continent, and those visits included Africans. And 2 of the visits of Africans were major and significant, and they affected American civilization. And American civilization was far more complex, far more advanced than was formerly believed. Earth satellites a few months ago revealed that the Native Americans, long before the coming of Europeans, had the most intricate network of irrigation canals ever discovered in agriculture.
Okay, let us clear up one thing before we go any further. In the book that came before Columbus, you used the terms Negro-Nubian, Negro-Egyptian. Why?
Well, that in some ways is unfortunate. I found it necessary to use the word Negro. I no longer use it. I'm now the editor of the Journal of African Civilizations, and I use the word Africoid for African types, skulls, etc. The reason why I was forced to use the word I had been trained in European anthropology and archaeology. All the books I had read used this term, not necessarily with the social implications which it has here. They use this term to separate Africoid types of people from Caucasoids or Mongoloid types, Asiatic and European types. Also, it is a word that has entered neutrally, without any social significance, in the languages of many people who do not have the same kind of prejudices as people in the Anglo-American and some of the Western nations who became colonial powers. Like in some languages in Europe, they use the term Niger, simply meaning black, without any of those connotations. Furthermore, the problem lay in that the word black could not always be used, because if you spoke of a black god, it may not be an African. You can have a black god who is not an African. Tezcatlipoca, for example, is a Native American god who is black, but he's not African. But there is a god, Nawalpili, who is both black and African. He's not only black in a ritual or symbolic sense, but he has Africoid features. So that was the problem I faced. And I had to make those connections, because when people talked of Nubians, they didn't often realize they were talking about black people.
In the first few pages of They Came Before Columbus, you write about when Columbus himself heard about about Africans, the possibility of Africans having been here years before. What about that?
Yes, so Columbus is the first man to give historical witness and evidence of Africans in America before him. In his journals, in his letters, you have evidence of this. He mentions that when he came back from his first voyage, he went to see the Portuguese. He didn't actually go there on purpose. A storm drew him into Lisbon, Portugal. He'd been sent out by the Spanish. The Portuguese invited him to the court, and there he learned from the Portuguese, who were moving across Africa, who had set up the first fort among Europeans in Africa, that African sailors had actually crossed over the Western Ocean and had found a land mass in the south. This was not what Columbus had found. Columbus found islands, which are now known as the Caribbean islands, but he had not gone on to a continental mass. The Africans had found the actual continental mass. And the Portuguese insisted that this continental mass in the south was 370 leagues, which is about 15 to 1600 miles away, according to whether you count the league as 4 or 4.5. There were differences in counting of a league, but it was about 1500 to 1600 miles away from Africa. And they pointed this out. And Columbus went back to Spain and he insisted, because the Portuguese promised to help him, he insisted that they should draw a line across the world, and that this line should be drawn 370 leagues away from the Cape Verde Islands across Africa, and that Spain would claim lands he had found on the other side, and if Portuguese found land within that line on the other side, they could claim it. And Brazil, which was visited by the Africans, was on the other side of the line. And this line was drawn in 1494. It was drawn up in June 1494, before any Europeans had come to South America, on the basis of African knowledge.
Okay, let's get down to the crux of the matter. How did these Africans come to the New World?
Okay, now one of the things, as I have pointed out, in the metallurgy, like the steel, etc., in astronomy, etc., there is a profound misunderstanding of African capacity. The Africans had ships. This is one of them. This is in East Africa. This ship, this is just a model which I found in Fort Mombasa in Kenya. This ship is a 70-tonner. Ships like these in the 13th century before Columbus took elephants to China, right across the Indian Ocean. But this is just, they had ships like this in East Africa before Christ, but there were ships in North Africa along the Mediterranean that were far more sophisticated than any ships the Europeans had. European shipping is not even European. The sail Columbus used comes out of the Arab-African world. The astrolabe comes out of the Arab-African world. They found in the desert before Columbus, in the period before Columbus, the Africans were using compasses and nautical instruments to navigate the desert. They had these instruments which were used to navigate the sea. They've done studies recently of navigation in West Africa showing the Africans did have boats along the Niger. The African had boats that could take 3 camels aboard ship. They had cabins, all of these along the Niger, which opens, if you go down the Senegambia at a certain point, it opens out into the Atlantic, and the Africans did have empires with an Atlantic border.
This is a simple question. It's going to sound simple, but you're talking about black people.
Yes.
So as you just heard for yourself, Africans came to the Americas from Africa by various means. Yet, the ADOS and FBA folks claim they are the Native Americans and not African. But even archaeological finds prove them wrong on that. For example, so to the ADOS and FBA groupies, please answer these questions. What conclusive evidence do you have that you have no African DNA? Did you take a DNA test? What were the results? What conclusive evidence do you have that you are strictly Native American? If, as you say, you have no African DNA and you are strictly Native American, why are you asking for reparations for slavery? Unity plays a crucial role in fomenting progress. When we're united, our objectives can mobilize resources and energy quicker. It helps amplify voices, demands attention, bridge divides, foster solidarity and mutual support, collaboration, peace, and progress, reminding us that we are always more powerful together than apart. Division does the complete opposite of all of the above. So if you're not for unity of our people, then it's obvious who you're really working for and what your objectives really are. Unity between our communities, or divide and conquer. The choice is totally yours. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.